In the year 865, a new and terrifying force arrived on English shores. Not a Viking raiding party, but a full-scale Viking invasion. The Great Heathen Army, a coalition of battle-hardened Viking warbands, swept across the land with ruthless efficiency. Northumbria, divided by internal strife, fell quickly. East Anglia offered tribute, then resistance, and paid dearly for it. These early campaigns would shatter Anglo-Saxon unity and mark the beginning of a long and brutal struggle for control of England. This is the story of when those English Anglo-Saxon kingdoms first came face to face with the Great Heathen Army. In my last episode, I covered how, since the Vikings had first raided the monastery at Lindisfarne in 793, the competing Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in England had come under increasingly frequent and larger scale raids by Scandinavian pirates, who we now know as Vikings. Contrary to popular imagination, the term Viking didn't refer to a single national group. Instead, the term Viking meant pirate or raider. The people we tend to refer to as Vikings were therefore pirates from across Scandinavia. In Anglo-Saxon records, they're actually referred to as heathens, Northmen, Norse, and Danes, but rarely Vikings. Nevertheless, the term Vikings is a catch-all that we use to describe them, and I will, with that health warning, do so too. Operating as small fleets, normally under a plethora of warlords, almost like pirate captains, they were always on the lookout for easy targets to plunder, and would ally with other leaders and fleets if it suited their purpose, both for protection and, more importantly, to raid larger, better defended targets. And whilst as pagans they were no lovers of Christianity, they were rarely driven by an anti-Christian agenda. Usually it was just that Christian monasteries were in remote locations, they were undefended, and the best bit for these Viking raiders, they contained valuable ornaments and gifts. In 864, however, the Vikings changed their tactics. For the first time, they actually wintered in England rather than heading home. Establishing themselves on the Isle of Thanet at the very far end of Kent, this meant that when the spring arrived, they could start raiding immediately. But when spring 865 came, something else changed too. They were joined by a huge fleet of fellow raiders. Led by three of the sons of the legendary Norwegian Viking Ragnar Lothbrok, they were no longer interested in simply raiding. They were intent on conquest. The Anglo-Saxons were about to come face to face with the Great Heathen Army. Whilst Anglo-Saxon chroniclers called it the Michel Hera, or the Great Army, and then added the term heathen to it because they were non-Christians, they were less than helpful when actually giving us their actual size. Whereas at earlier dates they had given fleet numbers, on this occasion they are annoyingly silent. But 865 was the very first time the chronicle used the term great or big to describe a Viking presence in England. And seeing as previous raids, which had never been given that title, had seen fleets of over 100 ships, you could surmise that it was, well, bigger than those. So, whilst the monks writing the chronicle unfortunately don't give us a figure, and historians are left to argue and surmise, the use of the word hera or army is significant, as previous raiding parties had not been described as such. So somewhere in the low thousands is probably as good an estimate as any, as the population of the various English kingdoms combined was maybe just over 1 million at this time. To have several thousand well-armed warriors landing on your shores would have been a very clear and present danger. And whatever its numbers, this Scandinavian army would deserve the name Great, just for the devastation it left in its wake, and the fact that it brought the Anglo-Saxon world to its knees. It would defeat and overthrow 3 of the 4 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in England, occupying 2 of them outright. And even the last kingdom, Wessex, would escape destruction by just a whisper. What made it even more awesome was that 3 of its leaders, Ubba, Halfdan and Ivar the Boneless, claimed to be the sons of the legendary Viking Ragnar Lothbrok, also known as Ragnar Lothbrok. And whilst the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles treats this latest incursion as simply another Viking raid, although be it by a huge army, the Norse saga, the tale of Ragnar's sons, claim that the invasion was to avenge their father, who had been killed by King Ælla of Northumbria in 865. In the saga, Ragnar had been captured by King Ælla and on his orders thrown into a pit of poisonous snakes, which were presumably adders, as they're the only venomous snake in Britain. The tale of Ragnar also names other sons being present in the Great Heathen Army, including Bjorn Ironside and Sigurd Snake in the Eye. All of which might ring a bell if you've watched the TV series Vikings. Now, I could do a whole pretty long episode about where the television show and the history deviate, and maybe I will in the future. What do you think? Suffice to say that the saga and history depart on this particular story. According to the saga, the Great Heathen Army landed in Northumbria and captured King Ælla, who is then executed in a ritual called the Blood Eagle, in which the victim's back is cut open and their lungs are removed from their ribcage and hung over their shoulders to resemble an eagle with its folded wings. Highly macabre, there are no references to this form of execution from any other Norse sources from this time. And whilst the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles fail to go into detail on quite a few events, for instance the size of this Great Heathen Army, they specifically claim that Ælla was killed in battle, and therefore he wasn't subjected to this sort of execution. And you might think that if Ælla had met his death in such a way as a Christian monarch, the monks writing the chronicle might have tried to elevate him to some sort of martyrdom status, as indeed would happen to another king who met his death just a few years later, and you're going to find out about him in a moment. The chronicle's record of events is different to the saga, and it goes like this. The Viking army sailed up the coast from Thanet and landed in the kingdom of East Anglia. Confronted with this army in his lands, the king, Edmund, came to terms with them and allowed them to winter there. And then in 866 they moved on, which must have been a relief for the East Anglian king. But their peace had come at a cost. The Viking leaders had demanded and obtained from Edmund horses. And now, rather than being sea raiders, the Great Heathen Army became a very large mounted cavalry. Leaving his kingdom and riding through the eastern part of Mercia, they crossed the border into Northumbria, where there was indeed a King Ælla. Although not the long-standing undisputed king as depicted in the TV series Vikings. Ælla, in fact, had only come to the throne about 3 years beforehand, having deposed the previous king, Osbert. Whilst Bishop Asser, the biographer of Alfred the Great, and the Anglo-Saxon chroniclers declare Ælla a usurper from humble origins, there are historians who claim that the two kings were in fact brothers. Ælla and Osbert were now fighting a bitter civil war. And into this turmoil and fractured northern kingdom rode the Great Heathen Army. Now, rather as they liked weak, undefended monasteries, the Vikings quite liked weak kingdoms too. I mentioned in my last episode that they had taken advantage of splits in the Frankish Empire in the past too. And now, with Ælla and Osbert's attention focused elsewhere, on the 1st of November 866 they swiftly occupied the old Roman city that we now call York. To the Romans it was Eboracum, to the Anglo-Saxons it was Ethelwich, but the Vikings were to give it a new name, Jorvik. And there they made themselves at home for the winter, but in the spring of 867 Ælla and Osbert had finally put their differences aside to deal with the invaders. On the 21st of March 867 they brought their combined armies to meet the Great Heathen Army outside of York. In the ensuing battle they broke the Vikings, who fled back into the city. Unable to close the gates in time, the Vikings were now chased through the streets. More Northumbrian warriors breached the crumbling Roman walls to press home the attack. And then the Vikings turned on their pursuers. Whether they had prepared an ambush like in the TV series, or whether, cornered, they simply fought for their lives is open to question. But the net result was that the Vikings snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. It was the Northumbrians who were routed, and both the rival kings were killed, although no mention of any Blood Eagle deaths. The power of Northumbria, which militarily had been in decline for a century since the Pictish victory at Dunnechten up in Scotland, was now broken forever. Whilst the Vikings installed a puppet king on the throne, they were now the masters of Northumbria. It would never again be an independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom. If the sons of Ragnar had wanted revenge for their father, they had it. But they and their followers in the Great Heathen Army had a much bigger agenda than simply revenge. It was now about conquest. With Northumbria under their control, who would be next? Well, the Anglo-Saxons didn't have to wait long to find out. Later that year, in autumn 867, they once more entered Mercia. But this time, they were not merely passing through. Following the River Trent upstream, they captured Nottingham. It would seem that the Mercians had actually fortified the hill upon which Nottingham Castle stands to this day. That fortification was now occupied by the Vikings, who proceeded to winter in the middle of Mercia. The Mercian king, Burgred, now requested the assistance of his southern neighbour, Wessex, to help remove them. In my last episode, we left Wessex with King Athelbert, son of Athelwulf, on the throne. Well, with rubbish timing, he had died soon after the Great Heathen Army had arrived in England. And now his brother, Athelred, was king. Athelred's sister was married to Burgred, so when the Mercian king called for assistance, he was actually calling in a family favour. Athelred duly marched north into the Midlands, accompanied by his younger and last of his remaining brothers, Alfred. The joint Mercian-Wessex army laid siege to the Vikings at Nottingham. However, the Vikings refused to venture out, and the Anglo-Saxons were unable to break through the defences, so a stalemate ensued. Eventually, the Mercian king paid the Vikings to vacate his territory. They retraced their journey back to Jorvik, where they now stayed for a whole year. But if the Anglo-Saxons were sighing in relief, they'd breathed too soon. 3 years previously, King Edmund of East Anglia had paid the Great Heathen Army to leave him alone. Remember all those horses? Well, now in the autumn of 869, he was about to learn the lesson which Rudyard Kipling later noted in a poem, that once you've paid him the Danegeld, you never get rid of the Dane. Led by two of the sons of legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, Ubba and Ivar the Boneless, the Viking army, having once more ridden through Mercia, and the Mercians let them do it, arrived back in Edmund's kingdom. But if they thought they could spend the winter there whilst the locals cowered, King Edmund of East Anglia had other ideas. In late November, he led his army against the Vikings. The result was never in doubt. The army of East Anglia was routed, and Edmund was killed. But the manner of his death is unclear. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says that he was killed, but somewhat unhelpfully doesn't actually say how or where. Maybe he died in battle fighting the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. But very soon, a different story began to circulate. According to this story, the defeated King Edmund was brought before Ivar the Boneless, but refused to either fight him or to share his kingdom as some sort of puppet ruler. Edmund also refused to renounce his Christian faith. Ivar the Boneless ordered his men to fire arrows into the king in execution, very similar to Saint Sebastian. According to a later monk, Edmund was covered in bristles like a hedgehog before being beheaded. Now, this story rapidly circulated, mainly thanks to Christian monks, and King Edmund was soon elevated to sainthood and was revered as the Martyr King. So there you go, a little bit like King Ælla or without the Blood Eagle, two different endings. You choose which one you prefer or which one you believe. But the net result was that the Vikings now took over East Anglia too. Ivar the Boneless now left and headed north, either to the Western Isles of Scotland or to Ireland. Quite what happened to him is a bit hazy. That's the problem when a culture records its history in oral sagas. But what is interesting is that a Viking leader suddenly appears in Ireland whom Irish chroniclers called Eamar. Where he came from they don't say, but they do say that he was the Viking king of Dublin from 870 to 873 when he died. The name Eamar is not too far removed from Ivar, and the start of his reign does coincide with Ivar leaving the Great Heathen Army. But I guess we'll really never know for sure. But what we do know is that back in England, or at least the future England, in the space of 4 years, the Great Heathen Army had defeated and occupied 2 of the 4 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and had been paid off by a third. Only Wessex had not felt their wrath, but that was all about to change. So join me next time as the Great Heathen Army turn their attention to Wessex. It is a heavyweight match that sees 6 battles in 6 months and the rise of Alfred the Great. In the meantime, thanks for joining me today, and a special thanks to my supporters and patrons. Keep well, and I'll see you again very soon.